It's time once again for Evidence for Faith. This is the show where we teach you how to defend the truths of Christianity. I'm Keith Kendricks.
Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Larakis.
And we are going to be talking about the evidence that shows the soul exists. But before we do that, I just want to go over, there's been a lot that's been happening politically. And one of the things that we concentrate on in this show is the Christian worldview and the impact that it ought to have on all areas of life, including politics. And the last two shows, we haven't had a chance to talk about politics. A lot's been happening, especially with this latest health insurance takeover, really is the best way to describe it. We are really on the front lines of a war of ideas. And ideas have consequences.
And bad ideas have bad consequences.
Exactly. So we are trying, with this show, we want to prove to you, not just tell you. We're not here just to tell you that Christianity is true, that we have great ideas. You ought to base your society, your political views on the ideas of the Bible. We're here to prove that they're true. It is really Christianity versus totalitarianism. That's the alternative. And it doesn't matter whether that totalitarianism is the atheist regimes of socialism and communism, or whether it's some kind of Islamic extremist totalitarian way of living. It is Christianity that provides the political freedom, the view that freedom is valuable and that we ought to have it as creations of God. The left focuses on selfishness. They're all about actualizing yourself, living for yourself, doing what you want, what your heart tells you. And
it's all in the guise of freedom, interestingly enough. But
yeah,
it's
exactly.
It's the I, me, mine syndrome, and whatever works for me, and the heck with you.
That's right. So here's an attractive thing for selfish people. How about we force others to pay for our insurance, our medical insurance? That sounds great. That's what we did. Just passed a law that at the point of a gun, I'm going to get you to pay for my insurance. So the Christian worldview is what led to the American experiment of liberty, self-government.
Now, what do you mean by self-government, Keith?
Well, it's not the idea. Self-government doesn't mean just that we're a democracy and so we make the rules. That's not what self-government is. Self-government is I govern myself. You govern yourself, and guess what? We don't need much of a government because I'm not going to lie, cheat, and steal. You're not going to lie, cheat, and steal. You're going to control yourself. You're going to self-govern. And then we need very little government. But if, the Socialist Democratic Party, which is really a coalition of special interests, comes along and develops this view of selfishness and, actualize yourself and do your own thing, then once you've got a population that is totally into themselves, you can manipulate them by appealing to envy and jealousy and, let's get back at those mean, rich people and let's take their money. Let's take their things. That sounds great. I'll vote for that.
Are you talking about redistribution of the wealth, Keith?
Absolutely.
Are you talking about haves and have-nots?
I'm talking about the hostile takeover of the health insurance, and the whole approach is government is the answer. And that is stage one thinking. That is like a chess player who only thinks one move ahead. What happens? You get destroyed, because you're not paying attention to the next move, what people will do in response to your move. So we have this government is the answer, let's fix it. So the fix winds up breaking things. The bigger the government, the smaller the person winds up being. If you have a big government, guess what? The government does everything for you. They take care of the poor. They take care of the sick. You don't have to do that. You don't have to give to the poor. You don't have to be kind to your neighbor. You don't have to help people because the government's doing it. It's just like Scrooge in Christmas Carol when people came around asking for money. Why should he give any money when there's already poorhouses and workhouses and prisons, right? The bigger the government, then the smaller the individual can be. That's something that Dennis Prager says on his show during the week. So the more government there is, also the less liberty you have. And liberty is very, very valuable. Liberty is given to us by God. It's not something that other men give us. It is something given to us by God, and we have to fight to protect it. Liberty is not an easy thing. This is an American experiment. It's lasted 200 plus years. Will it last into the future? Can we self-govern ourselves, or do we have to have a monopolistic, controlling government to run our lives for us? That's the big question. That's the American experiment.
Well, I find it interesting, Keith, that there are about 19 states, I believe the number is thus far, that are actually suing at a state level to block this legislation that's going to mandate this insurance reform that the Democrats have shoved down the throats of the American people. Also, about 75% of all of the polls that have been done by outside agencies, CNN, Gallup poll, and so forth, have shown that the American people are actually against this legislation in its current written form.
And I described it as a hostile takeover. And do you remember how the left in newspaper articles always talks about business hostile takeovers and how wrong that is, how morally wrong that is? Well, here was a hostile takeover of an industry, the health insurance industry, against bipartisan opposition, but yet they still insisted they insisted they were going to shove it through. This makes me think about 2 days ago when that Polish jet flying to Russia crashed and killed the president and his wife of Poland and all those people. Because what was the pilot doing? He was told twice, I'm told, to not to land. It was foggy. They did not have the right instruments to approach this. It was Western instruments with a Eastern landing system. They couldn't land by instruments. They had to land visually, and he circled the runway. He tried landing twice before, but he was determined to get that plane in, and he wound up killing everybody. And that is a beautiful metaphor for what the Democratic leadership has done to the healthcare insurance industry. And, it's just done terrible damage and is going to do terrible damage. So, the normal state of human beings down through the millennia is poverty and violence. It takes a lot of work to keep us from the brink of collapse, and it takes a lot of liberty. So if you want to decrease violence, we need more Christianity. We need more Christian ideas actually applied to the government, more freedom. If we have a bigger God, then we have a smaller government. And that's what we need. That's what we are here to do on Evidence for Faith. I am Keith Kendricks.
Hi, I'm Dr. Michael Arakis.
You can call us at 609-398-1020. You can also email us at evidenceforfaith.com. Go to the link, check out the podcast, check out the website, and there's a contact button there for you to email us. But this is where you come for the evidence that Christianity is true. And one of the things we're going to be talking about today is the evidence for the soul. Do the listeners know that there is scientific evidence for the soul?
Keith, before we get into that discussion, and it's going to be a really interesting show, I wanted to make a couple of comments about the healthcare debate.
Absolutely.
Because the debate still goes on. If we go back 75 years ago, okay, before there was a terrific need for costly health insurance, okay, by and large, the family took care of family members who were in need, both physically,
right,
and medically and so forth. Now, families knew what the circumstances are. If somebody was out of a job, the family would support them, and certainly the church and the community would have fundraisers and so forth. You still get a feeling for some of that even to this day. But by and large, community, church, and family took care of their own because they knew the intimate details of what was happening to an individual or the baby that was sick or whatever.
Which made them perfectly qualified to do that.
Correct.
Instead of somebody outside.
So once you get big government stepping in and doing this, there's so much room for abuse where people who really are not hurting or who are not qualified really for that big handout are using the system and abusing the system.
Right.
And so there's a whole lot of room for that. Whereas the intimate details of somebody's family circumstance, be it a job, finances, health issues, and so forth, was very clearly known to the immediate people who took care of that individual.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the things we're going to lose in this big government thing.
Now, I think you wanted to mention a couple upcoming things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
let's do that now.
Well, first and foremost, I wanted to mention that this past week we did a live show at the First Baptist Church in Egg Harbor City on death by crucifixion.
Right, that was last week's show.
Yep, we did a resurrection breakfast for the men's group there. It was very well attended, and the response was very good. So we wanted to invite our listeners to consider that sort of a project even at your own church. Keith and I are more than willing to travel to do a live broadcast in front of the church group, which would then air that Sunday afternoon. We are, in fact, contemplating doing a similar event at the same church, First Baptist Church in Egg Harbor. The men there want to put on a breakfast event in advance of Mother's Day, the first Saturday of June. We plan on being there to do a similar breakfast event. Breakfast would be from 8 until 9, and then we would go live in front of the audience from 9 until 10, and then have the broadcast done the following day. So that turned out to be a very, very nice venue for the people at hand, and it was certainly a different experience for us to be in front of a live group. We were able to field questions, and it was very, very well received.
Yep. So we will get the audience more information as that approaches.
Great.
All right. Well, what about the soul then? It's been historically something that the Christian church has always taught, that there is a soul, that you're really two parts. You are a soul and a body. So people are not just one thing. They're not just a body, and somehow their thoughts or their consciousness is a result of their body. They are actually two things, a soul and a body.
And even when we die, the soul continues to exist. Now, we are going to cover some near-death experiences that talk about that a little bit later in the broadcast, but even when we die, the soul continues to exist, and ultimately it will be reunited with the body. And this is also a biblical teaching. When the body is resurrected, it will be reunited with the soul.
Right. An example would be Jesus, right? What was he doing when his body was dead in the tomb? He was still there. He was still doing things. He still existed. He wasn't gone for 3 days and then came back, right? He was still there. So there was something about Jesus that continued to exist even though his body was dead.
And the other thing is Paul has said himself to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord.
Right.
So the implication there is that the body's dead, the body's buried, or the body's cold, but yet the soul has advanced to a point somewhere in the heavens to be with the Lord.
Right. So, but there's a problem because there are Christian leaders, Christian scholars, Christian teachers who have given up on the idea of the soul, the existence of the soul. They become essentially physicalists that believe that only physical things exist in the universe. And so your soul isn't really a non-material thing, a non-material substance. It's actually just like an emanation from your body.
Right. And some even say that the concept of the soul is just read back into Scripture, and that it was something that came from the Greek writings and even pagan philosophy. So they've caved under the pressures of academia, and certainly to an extent by evolution and theistic evolutionary thought, whereby they say that the body is something that's evolving, and there's really no place for a soul to evolve. Therefore, there
Right.
can't be a soul.
Right. And this is something that Darwin was actually well aware of, and he discussed this as a problem for his theory. If there is such a thing as a soul, his theory doesn't address it. His theory is only about where human beings' bodies came from, that they developed over this very long, very gradual progression from other types of animals. And so if you then are going to say, well, there's this immaterial thing called the soul that's implanted maybe by God into the human being, now you've got God doing something, God active. And he says, well, if you're going to allow God to do things like that, then God might have been active the entire time through the evolutionary process. So he said he believed, therefore, because it conflicted with his theory, that he couldn't allow the concept of a soul and that human beings had a soul. So he made the statement that there is no such thing as a soul, that you are only your body.
Yeah, it's interesting because evolution typically addresses the physical processes of life,
Right.
and there's no room for that soulish quality, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes, in the theory of evolution, it makes the soul a highly unlikely probability, and consequently, what happens is that people actually lose confidence in not only the existence of the soul, but by direct evolution, if I can use that term, they lose confidence in the concepts of heaven and hell.
Right, exactly. It's a natural progression. So it undermines the teachings of the Bible. So there's this issue then, call it a mind-body problem. Are humans one kind of thing, or are they really two kinds of things? So you can divide people into strict physicalist, let's say, who believes that humans are only one kind of thing. They are only physical. They are only atoms and molecules. And whatever kind of emotions or consciousness or thoughts or whatever it is about yourself that you want to call yourself, that is all just a reflection of what's going on electrochemically inside your brain.
But that doesn't address the bigger issue, Keith, because we know intuitively that we're more than just a physical conglomeration of chemicals and charged atoms and physical processes and chemical reactions and everything else.
Right. So you would be a dualist then.
Well, I used to be a physicalist before I became a believer. Interesting.
Yes?
Because I had a false religion.
Yep.
It's called biochemistry and medicine.
So when you thought of yourself, that's kind of interesting. When you were thinking, I will do something, or I think such and such, you just thought of it as this is your brain.
Yeah.
It's simply your brain.
My brain was in charge.
It's interesting because this then gives you the ability to, whatever you think, then that's okay. Mm-hmm. Because that's just your brain. You are your brain. Mm-hmm. So if your brain thinks, well, I'm going to steal the money that somebody left here on the table, that's just your brain. It's just you. It's,
Well, no, the thought wasn't stealing. It was there,
mm-hmm.
and if I didn't take it, somebody else might, maybe.
Right. So, so those are the two camps: the physicalist and the dualist. So now we have to try and figure this out. Well, can science help us here? Can science distinguish something immaterial from the brain. Well, really, in a definitional sense, let's say, no, it can't, because science deals with physical things. It deals with cause and effect. It deals with experiments. It deals with actual physical objects and measuring them, quantifying them. So science really is kind of out of its realm in the first place to say that there is no soul, because that's not science's field. So science actually ought to shut up about whether or not there is a soul. So the scientist who says there is no soul, there is no inner life, then he's already out of his field.
Yeah, he's out of his domain because it's not something that he can actually put his fingers on or measure.
Mm-hmm.
They're into quantifiable items, or at least describing physical properties and characteristics.
Right.
Once you're beyond that, you're out of your domain.
Right.
Okay, so the soul then either belongs in the spiritual domain or at least in the philosophical domain.
Right. And the philosophical domain is where we can go now, because in the philosophical domain, we are allowed to use our minds to try to, in a sense, do mental thought experiments. Am I the same as my brain, or am I something different than my brain? So how are we going to tell that? How are we going to tell? Well, one way that you can tell is if your mind, if there's something that we know about your mind that is true of, say, mental properties, that is not true of physical properties or vice versa, then we can know they are not the same. Does that make sense? It's just a simple philosophical question. Either if they're the same, if the brain and the mind are the same, then they'll have the same properties. That makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they have different properties, then they are not the same thing. So that's one way. And so you need to simply ask yourself, are mental properties the same as physical properties? Well, I think everybody, just by their own introspection, because you all have a brain and you all have a mind, I hope, if you're listening, I hope you have a mind, then you'll know that they are different. In fact, you actually know much more about your own mind than you do about your brain, is my guess. Anybody ever seen their own brain? You haven't even seen your brain, but you know all about your own mind, your own thought processes, your own inner self.
You know, Keith, I take myself back to the anatomy laboratory when I was in medical school with this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And we dissected all the nerves, and we even used a saw to cut the cap of the skull off of our body's head, if you will.
Yeah.
And we actually could remove the brain in toto and look at it.
Wow.
Okay, now, knowing that this guy, and we had a nickname for him, his name was Rodney.
Okay.
We took Rodney's brain out, and we could look at it, and we knew that he had a brain, but we knew nothing about him. We didn't know what his thoughts were during his lifetime.
Right.
Didn't know what he did for a living. All we know is that he was dead and that
But
he donated.
couldn't you tell that by measuring his brain?
No, could not.
What about looking at it under a microscope?
All we know is that the physical characteristics of his brain, whether it was the size or the weight,
Right.
whether or not there was a stroke present, whether or not there was a tumor present, whether or not there was atherosclerosis, hardening the arteries. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we could measure.
Yes.
That we could physically quantify.
Right.
And isolate and even take sections of the brain and look at under the microscope. But there was nothing that we could tell about the inner workings of his brain, his thoughts, his previous history, his likes, his dislikes, his emotions, the love of his life, all of the things that you and I take for granted, all the emotions and feelings and fears and everything that makes us who we are. We had no idea what went on in Rodney's head.
Right.
And
So it just shows that there is something different.
There is something more, and that's where we get back to the dualist theory.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the physicalist just believes that there's a physical body and a physical brain, and it works, and therefore that's all it is. Whereas the dualist feels that there's more than just the physical body and the brain, and the electrochemical properties that they have. It has to do with the very essence of that being that we call the soul.
If you are just joining us, you are listening to Evidence for Faith with apologist Keith Kendricks and physician
Hi,
Mike
I'm
Larakis.
Dr. Larakis.
I
How are
introduced you this time.
Oh, how
Did you
about
like
that?
that? I'm
That was
changing
different.
things up, yeah. You can call us at 609-398-1020. That's 609-398-1020. If you disagree with us, call us. You go right to the front of the line, in fact, if you disagree with us. The people who agree with us have to wait until we're done with all the disagreeers, and then we do the agreeers. All right, so we're talking about the existence of the soul in the human body and the fact that you can tell they are two different things because they're different. Mental states, mental properties do not have size, do not have shapes. They don't have electrical charge, right? Where, you can't describe where they're located in your head. Okay, I'm thinking of the color red. Is that closer to my right ear or to my left ear? Right? There is no spatial location to these two mental states. And conversely, physical states, physical properties cannot be true or false, such as a thought can. A thought can be true or false. So there's definitely a difference between physical and mental properties. Therefore, they are two different things. They are not the same thing.
Right. And we can talk about emotions, we can talk about sensations, we can talk about pleasure. There are a whole bunch of things that happen in our own mind that makes it different than just the physical state of having a brain. There are processes that happen inside our own minds that change day by day, moment by moment. Emotional upsetments, anger, rage, pleasure, contentment. All of these things are not something that can be actually measured in a laboratory.
Right.
But yet they can be studied.
Now, and we've heard of these kinds of studies that people have done where they've, a neurologist will take a conscious patient and he will open up his head and they'll do very fine electrical probes into the brain and they'll activate different parts of the brain. So a neurologist can know an awful lot about your brain and even activate different parts. But then if he wants to see what happened, what did the activation do? What does he do?
He asks the patient what he thought of, or
exactly,
or what experience he had that brought him back to a previous experience when he was a kid.
That's right. What memory are you having?
Or a taste, or some pleasurable moment in his life.
That's right.
He can sit, but you know what? He can't measure it.
Right.
All he can do is ask the patient to subjectively describe to him what happened.
Right. So no amount of measuring the electrical flow or any of that can tell him anything about what that individual is experiencing. So it again shows that there really are two different things, that there is the mind, the brain, and then there is the brain. So and I know what my thoughts and feelings are just by paying attention to them. See, this is one thing that makes human beings different even from animals, because obviously animals, you can do experiments and show that they have thoughts, right? Well, human beings have thoughts about their thoughts, right? I mean, we have desires like, maybe an animal would have, but we also have desires about our desires, right? And you never see this at any animal level. You don't see this kind of thought upon thought and the reflectiveness of how we can think.
It's interesting, Keith, from a scientific or even a medical or a psychological or a neurosurgical perspective. Now I'm speaking, from a medical point of view. A scientist can't do any of that. He can't measure what your thoughts are, what the thought processes are. All they can do is monitor brain states. Okay, they can do that with an EEG. They can measure brain waves. They can do evoked potentials. There's all kinds of stuff that they can do in a scientific setting, whether it's a hearing test or visual acuity testing. There's a whole bunch of stuff that they can measure, but they can't measure thought processes.
Right.
So they can have all of this knowledge about the brain, but they can't measure anything that has to do with your thoughts or your emotional makeup.
Exactly. Now, it's sometimes said that computers are going to gain consciousness. And really, this is in the realm of science fiction. There's nothing, even in the most massive, most fast supercomputer, there's nothing at all like a soul or a mind. Computers, they say, play chess now. Well, I have some very good software at home, top-notch grandmaster chess-playing software. And let me tell you, it doesn't really play chess.
It's a program.
Yeah, it just calculates. It's like a pre-programmed calculator that figures out some mathematical formula to tell whether a certain chess position is, in the opinion of the software designer, better than a different chessboard position.
Move, yeah.
And that's all that the software does. Computers don't think. They don't really read data. They take it in and manipulate it. They're not thinking about what's going on. A computer is more like what a brain is, a chunk of meat instead of a chunk of tubes. I guess it's not tubes anymore. Transistors, that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, all it does is analyze data and then gives you the next maneuver. That's all it does.
But something else has been happening in the scientific realm that we can go to that is additional evidence that there is a soul. There is something that is completely different from the brain, and that is what we have in near-death experiences. So let's get into near-death experiences, but once again, I just want to let people know, if you are joining us, this is Evidence for Faith, the Christian show about Christian evidences and worldview. We help Christians become thinkers, and thinkers become Christians.
Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Larakis.
And I'm Keith Kendricks.
And I would encourage you to call us at 398-1020, especially if you or somebody you know, a relative, a friend, coworker who has had a near-death experience, and share with us what happened and what the thought process of that individual was when they had their near-death experience.
And in the meantime, we're going to take a look at a book called Life After Death, The Evidence by Dinesh D'Souza, and that has a couple of very interesting near-death experiences in it. He talks about one 11-year-old boy who suffered a cardiac arrest, had no heartbeat, was resuscitated, and had an out-of-body experience. And in this out-of-body experience, he could see the doctors, he could see the nurses working on his body, and after his recovery, he was able to accurately summarize the whole resuscitation procedures that were used on him, the colors, the whereabouts of the instruments in the room, even what the medical staff said to each other. And of course, there's really no way that an 11-year-old boy could have known all that ahead of time. This really does seem to be strong evidence, and these kinds of examples, and there are many of them. What's interesting is, people claim a lot of strange things, okay? People claim to have seen UFOs, and there are a lot of people that claim to see UFOs. People claim that they have lived in other lives, okay, that they have memories of other lives. But what's interesting is when you research this, the UFO thing turns out, a lot of people with problems or things that they just couldn't explain. The other future lives happens a lot in India. They have a lot of people there, or places where they already believe in reincarnation. But near-death experiences seem to be very universal. They happen in all cultures. They happen to all kinds of people in about the same percentages. So there's a small percentage of people in every population around the world that have had these near-death experiences. So it's a different kind of thing. It does seem to be something that we need to take very seriously. There's another one given in Dinesh D'Souza's book talking about a Seattle woman who reported a near-death experience after she had a heart attack. And she told a social worker by the name of Kimberly Clark, who later wrote about it and published this account, that she was separated from her body and had not only risen to the ceiling, but actually floated outside the hospital altogether. Now, the social worker, Clark, didn't believe her, but she gave a small detail that caught her attention. The woman said that she had been distracted by the presence of a shoe on the third floor ledge at the north end of the emergency room building. And she described it as a tennis shoe with a worn patch, and that one of the laces was stuck under the heel of the shoe. So the woman asked this Miss Clark to go and find the shoe. Clark found, she thought it was ridiculous, of course, at first, but she decided she'd go through and take a look. So she went out, started looking around outside the building, and had to actually go out onto the third floor ledge to find the shoe because it couldn't be seen from the window. So she checked, and it was there. So, so really another incredible afterlife experience that's been very carefully documented. And these kinds of things do seem like they're really true. Other accounts have been of people who are blind being able to see after death. So people born blind have a near-death experience, and they describe being able to see, something that they had never been able to do before.
These near-death experiences help to give us some insights into the existence of the soul, because when they have this out-of-body experience, the assumption that we have is that it's their soul that's been separated from their body and is looking down on the whole scenario.
Right.
I think that one of the most compelling examples that comes to mind of a near-death experience is the case of Pam Reynolds. Now, this is a case that occurred on August 1st, 1991, and is chronicled very nicely by a cardiologist by the name of Michael Sabom, S-A-B-O-M, M.D., and I'm going to read some excerpts from the Christian Research Journal from 2003. It's volume number 2, 2003. And basically what he's doing is giving us a little synopsis and some insights as to what happened. This gal, Pam Reynolds, had 2 huge cerebral aneurysms, okay, and she was slated to be anesthetized, and her body was to be chilled down to a chilling 60 degrees. Now, folks, mind you, when the body is less than 94 degrees, it causes death, because cellular function as we know it cannot exist. Cellular metabolism shuts down at a cold enough temperature. So at the temperature of 60, basically all body functions ceased to exist. Now, they were able to keep her alive because she was on a heart-lung bypass machine, and they were able to drain her blood volume completely and totally into this machine and keep it circulating so that it wouldn't coagulate. So it was kept in a constant state of correct temperature and correct physiologic mechanism so that it could be reinfused into her body at a later time. But anyway, this lady's body was completely chilled down to 60 degrees, and by doing that, they were able to totally shrink the aneurysms in her brain so that the neurosurgeon could get in there. Now, this occurred, again, August 1st, 1991, and Dr. Robert Spetzler was the chief neurosurgeon in charge at the Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, Arizona. Okay, now, this lady was interviewed after her near-death experience, and some startling things came to light when she was interviewed. She was a singer, and she had perfect pitch, and she states that the first thing that she noticed when she was unconscious, if you will, anesthetized, deep sleep, was that there was a perfect deep pitch that she heard. Okay, now she was already unconscious, and this deep pitch was later isolated to be the sound of the whirring bone saw, which literally cut into her scalp where they removed part of her skull and were able to isolate the aneurysm. Now, the buzzing that she heard was actually the buzzing of the circular saw going through her skull, and when they went back later to investigate what pitch that this whirring bone saw would manufacture when it was at full speed, it was a perfect deep pitch. Now, that's fascinating.
Yes.
Because this gal could actually hear it, even though she was totally unconscious, and her blood volume was totally out of her body. Okay, and her body was at a chilling 60 degrees.
And they had EEGs hooked up to her
yes.
that were flatline.
That's correct. At 60 degrees.
Plus her ears were plugged.
Her ears were plugged, and they were actually she had sensor monitors in her ear canals to monitor brainstem potentials.
Right.
Okay, so her EEG was totally flatlined. The brainstem was non-functional, totally flat. And of course, her heart had flatlined. Okay, and she was on the heart-lung bypass at that point in time. But the heart, again, not beating, not functioning, because they didn't want any pulsations going on inside the brain at the time of the surgery. So anyway, Dr. Spetzler was able to isolate the biggest of the two aneurysms, and he was able to clip them. Okay, her blood volume was then restored, reinfused, and the lady came back to life. Her brainstem potentials came back on the EEG. Her brain waves, her functional conscious brain waves came back, and she was restored back to life. Okay, and then they started interviewing this lady. Now, the interesting thing is that she found herself being awakened in a position with this perfect deep pitch of the bone-whirring saw blade in her head. Okay, and she was perched atop of the surgeon's right shoulder, watching this whole thing happen, which is incredible. When you think about it.
And she described it as much better than regular vision.
Yes, she said it was incredibly clear, more clear vision than she'd ever experienced in her life. It's almost like high-def TV as opposed to analog TV, I guess.
Right.
She said, but her vision was incredibly clear. She states that when she was interviewed further, she said that she felt herself as this cardioplegia and this near-death experience was going on, she was being pulled through a tunnel, a vortex, a dark tunnel, and there was this pinpoint of light at the distant far end of the tunnel, and she could hear her grandmother calling her, okay? And as she got closer, it became an intensely brightly lit situation, and she could see figures and people talking, and she wanted to go and join them. She wanted to be in the light, but they wouldn't let her. She was not allowed to be into and completely into the light at that point in time. And then finally, when she was being brought back to life in the operating room, her uncle escorted her back down that dark corridor, and then she found herself awakening in a perfectly conscious state again. It's a fascinating, fascinating case.
And she also was able to recognize equipment in the room,
yes,
people that she didn't recognize, and she described a lot of instruments that she didn't know what their function was, but she was able to describe them.
Right, and in their perfect function. Yes, exactly.
So this is one of the most well-attested near-death experiences ever, because it happened in a teaching facility. They immediately investigated it right away. They checked into every possible way she could have learned about, like the bone saw. She described how it came in like a socket set with a bunch of different size saws. Well, no one had ever shown her that in her preoperative teaching. No one showed her what this stuff was like, and she described it in incredible detail.
It's even more fascinating, Keith, because we in science and medicine do case control studies. Well, she in her second surgery was subjected to a different set of circumstances in a different scenario, almost like a control situation. And
Right.
let me give you the specifics of that. She goes back to the operating room 9 days later for the second aneurysm to be repaired.
Right.
But because most of the pressure that was being exerted by the biggest of the two aneurysms had already been fixed, they didn't feel the need to put her through the rigors of a 60-degree body temperature and everything else that she had gone through in the first one.
Right.
Nor did they feel that she needed to have the heart-lung bypass machine functioning. So she went through a standard neurosurgical procedure 9 days later. So there was no hypothermia and there was no cardiac arrest induced. Okay, and while under anesthesia, testing of the brainstem and the cerebral hemispheres showed normal function during the operation, and she had normal and well-maintained responses throughout. No near-death experience was reported
Right.
because she was not subject to the, let's say, death-like clinical situation that she had experienced 9 days earlier.
Right. If you are just joining us, you are listening to Evidence for Faith. I'm Keith Kendricks.
Hi, I'm Dr. Mike Larakis.
And you can check us out on our website, evidenceforfaith.com. That's evidence, the number 4, faith.com. We are talking about the evidence, the existence of the soul, and what science has been able to learn about the soul these days. Well, one of the complaints about these near-death experiences is that, if the biblical view is correct, then how come it seems like all the near-death experiences are all good, right? They seem to go to a happy place. They want to be there. They're with friends and family. And, the Bible talks about hell a lot. So how come nobody has any near-death experiences where they go to hell? Well, actually, that's not true. There have been many documented cases of patients claiming that they had gone to an incredible place where they were incredibly tortured, in pain, suffering greatly. And one of the first physicians to write about this is Maurice Rowling. I remember reading this book back when it came out. It's called Beyond Death's Door. In fact, I was working as a nurse in the CCU unit, and I worked with one of the nurses who worked with Dr. Rowling doing some of his research and gathering this information. And he reports a number of frightening and hellish near-death encounters, and other people with negative other people have reported it, and the thinking is that the negative experiences are either repressed, that the mind, they are so horrible that the mind represses them, or that people are just embarrassed to talk about what happened to them, that they had a bad experience. And so when they're asked, they won't report these experiences. But other investigators have been Dr. Bruce Grayson, Nancy Evans, Bush, and they've issued a report called Distressing Near-Death Experiences. There was British researcher Margot Gray in her study called Return from Death, also reports a number of dark and gruesome near-death experiences. So again, fitting with the truth of the Bible and the truth of Christianity.
Well, Keith, let me just throw this out there, and I want to get into the free will argument, if you will, relative to the soul.
All right.
And I'm gonna pose the question to you from a naturalist, physical science perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let me try throwing this out there. Okay, if I'm just a brain,
Mm-hmm.
okay, even with consciousness, I'll grant you that, then all my behaviors are fixed by my brain, my genetic makeup, the environment,
Mm-hmm.
all of my past and present experiences, okay, and the physical objects that my brain is interpreting behave by all the natural laws and the inputs that we would expect in our own life experiences and everyday living, okay. Free choices, however, are going to require that I am more than just my body.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, here's a problem. Okay, if I am my body and I am an immaterial mental substance, where does that leave me with respect to free will?
Yeah. The only way you can have free will is if there's something immaterial in you that is telling your physical part to do something. Like, Mike, would you please raise your right hand?
Or should I pick you up at 3 o'clock to be in the studio by 4?
Right. You make a free will choice, and your body actually does what your mind told it to do. So there again, this is actual evidence that there is something different, from the soul to the brain. And believe it or not, Mike, this has been demonstrated on PET scanners. Now, PET scanners are positron emitting tomography. This is a new type of scan. It's been around now for at least 1 decade, and it's very, very useful in examining the brain because they can use this to see the flow of electricity through the brain. And there have been several different neurosurgeons, neurologists who, using PET scanners, have documented the existence of a soul, of a mind that controls the brain and not the other way around. If your brain is all there is and your mind is a product of your brain, then the brain is in control and the brain tells the mind what to think, how to behave. But what these PET scanners have shown is that they can introduce new thoughts, new ideas into your mind, and your mind will actually rework your brain and redesign it. And you have one of those books written by Dr. Schwartz, a neurologist. It's called The Mind and the Brain. And he shows in this book that mental activity not only affects physical outcomes, but that it also reconstitutes and reprograms the neurons in our brains. And Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz has had tremendous breakthroughs in the treating of OCD, and which is like the character Monk on the TV show, obsessive compulsive disease. And in the past, they used to try to desensitize people by, if you're afraid of spiders and you want to overcome that, they would bring a spider into near you, and slowly try to acclimatize you. And that's very uncomfortable and hasn't been very successful. But Schwartz developed what he terms cognitive therapy, in which patients learn to refocus their minds away from the compulsion and to redirect their thoughts and actions to some activity, ideally something more pleasant. And not only did these treatments show impressive results, but Schwartz has also found that they had the effect of rewiring the patient's brain so that he no longer experienced the paranoid and destructive OCD urges. So in other words, patients weren't just modifying their obsessive thoughts, they were actually modifying their disordered brains. So there is something inside of you that controls your brain, your mind. Now, another example, physician, do you not tell your patients that mental stress can contribute to high blood pressure?
Oh, absolutely.
So your mind, and what about the placebo effect?
Absolutely.
That is your mind controlling your physical body. Patients think they're getting medicine, and therefore their bodies respond as if they actually did. Mike, do you know about something called the nocebo effect? The nocebo effect.
No, teach me.
Well, this is what happens to a person's body when he believes he's been infected or contaminated. Guess what happens? He gets sick. He thinks, because it's a nocebo, he's given a sugar pill, but he thinks it's going to make him nauseous. He actually becomes nauseous because his mind controls him. And that, this is...
So, Keith, tell me, what is the soul?
What is the soul?
Give me the definition. You got 30 seconds.
The soul is the entire real you that contains your mental processes, your emotions, your will, and your faculties that interact with your body. Also has a spirit. So I have a body, and I also have a spirit. That's me, the soul, which is the real me, the all of me. So we've just given you evidence that there is a soul. It's now time to take care of it. Start reading your Bible, go to church, become a Christian. You have been listening to Evidence for Faith. Join us again next Sunday at 4 p.m. And always remember that the best reason for being a Christian is because it's true.